My name is Era, and I'm the host of the Tamil Creator Podcast. I chat with creators from all over the world to share their stories and discuss hot topics in a way that I hope inspires, educates, and entertains you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Tamil Creator. I'm your host, Era. Today, I have Cheyanne Ratnam, and I got quite a bio for her. Thank you, first of all, Cheyanne, for jumping on. But Cheyanne Ratnam, she's passionate about equity and developing inclusive and accessible spaces and processes. She has dedicated much of her time and expertise in welfare and homelessness. She is the co-founder and executive lead of the Ontario Children's Advancement Coalition. Cheyanne went from experiencing suicidality in grade 5 to homelessness and to welfare to experiencing violent relationships to still somehow coming up above the water. She's an expert in residence with CWLC and is an advocate for childhood sexual abuse and GBV/IPV, being a survivor of both. She is also an independent consultant, engagement specialist, personal development coach, capacity builder, media commentator, public speaker, ambassador of the CAFDN, and partakes in various communities through volunteerism. So that's quite a bio, Cheyanne. So thank you for jumping on.
Thank you for having me. Just a correction. So that's probably like a bio that we utilized quite a number of years ago. So the only difference is the resident stuff, it doesn't exist anymore. So that program is done, but everything else is still there.
Well, thank you. Well, for me, I always like to kind of start at the beginning. I feel like things or like choices made in like childhood or like your formative teenage years really kind of impacts who you become as an adult. So I guess, and I guess a lot of your story does start there as well. So I would love to kind of ask you to share, what you feel comfortable sharing about your childhood and formative teenage years and why that resulted in you eventually, becoming so passionate about, as you mentioned, or like in your bio, pursuing a career in creating equity, developing inclusive and accessible spaces and processes.
Yeah, I mean, like many of us, I came here as a refugee myself, as a minor with my single mom. And I think that was really the backdrop, the beginning, right? And honestly, I would even say before I was born, the backdrop was already created because many of us who are, from Jaffna and Elam, our struggles happened before we were born. And so that kind of gets translated through trauma, right? In terms of parent to child. And I feel like that was my start. And then when we came here, there was just a lot of discrepancies that many people do experience when you are growing up in a new country and your parents have a snapshot of what life should be like based on the morals and values and principles that they grew up with. And then they see us kind of like growing up in a new country with new standards and so on and so forth. And there's tension. So there's a lot of tension in my home. But then I also experienced like shadeism because I'm darker. I look like my dad. My mom's side is all very, very light. They get mistaken for like North Indian all the time. And so I also experienced that. And because of the fact that Canada, like I'm so happy to be Canadian, but one of the things that it lacks is providing preventative supports to families when it comes to mental health. And I know it's trying to improve that now, but especially in the 90s, that was really not a thing. So my mom's unmet needs meant that there was a lot more escalated problems at home. And I was definitely a little bit different than most kids because I was definitely an advocate from when I was little, something that especially little girls are not supposed to be doing. And I think that part of all these different moving, realities, facilitated me into, experiencing suicidality when I was in grade 5, and not really knowing what to do about that. And obviously, for many many young people, there's no real outlet for mental health when you're a little kid. When you're 16, maybe you do because there might be a youth homeless shelter, but all those things have age restrictions. And back in the day, you just didn't know what existed, and nothing did exist. And that precipitated into, experiencing homelessness. And homelessness is a spectrum, right? When we think about homelessness, often we think about street involvement, but street involvement is not the only type of homelessness there is. There is hidden and silenced homelessness as well. And when I say hidden and silenced homelessness, I'm talking about especially racialized communities where we're couch surfing, we're sleeping over at whoever's home. So in my case, I was, couch surfing and crashing at my best friend's home, or going to parties just to have somewhere to be. So I didn't have to go back home because home was a very violent place for me. And it's no fault of my mom. It's really the fault of the system for not providing the supports that we needed as a family unit, and also individually as a single mom parent, coming from a war-torn country and so on and so forth. And so that was when I was about 13 or so. And shortly after, I entered the youth criminal justice system. And it's something that a lot of people find stigmatizing, but I don't. I was there because of the precipitation of domestic issues that really exploded at one point. And I then was asked if I wanted to go back home. And I knew that even at that young age, I knew I couldn't go back home because I wouldn't be alive. And that's because of suicidality, right? And also my mom's mental health and how that would facilitate me to want to do that even more. And then at that point, I then transitioned to the child welfare system. And in the child welfare system, there's quite a bit of different placements. And I was placed in group homes, which is like the worst placements in that spectrum or levels of placements. And honestly, it was my saving grace. I'm very it's interesting. It's like a double-edged sword. I'm lucky to be in there, but then also not lucky to be in there because there's a lot of adverse experiences that you face there. And the outcomes for people, young people, especially coming through group homes, is dismal, including death when you age out. And you're also more likely to be targeted for human trafficking. I was a target. And luckily I had gut instincts. And I think that gut instinct came because when I was 8, I survived childhood sexual abuse. And so I was just always on edge and alert. And when I started to feel different or feel like something was going on with interactions, I was like, yeah, I'm not going to go there anymore or see this person anymore. And that was the only reason why I kind of escaped that reality. But I know siblings who have been trafficked across Canada in terms of child trafficking and human trafficking. But all of these experiences really facilitated me to choose my pathway. And even after I exited the child welfare system, where you get cut off at 18, I found myself in the adverse realities that many young people do face when they exit these systems. And that was intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And when I say violence, I mean like when my partner almost tried to kill me a couple of times, and then also then becoming their PSW, basically, where I was taking care of them because they had addictions, and then they passed away due to their addiction. So I've been through a lot in life, and I feel like the way that I do my work is really in part due to my own experiences and my learnings and the inequities that I've experienced and witnessed in terms of my own story, but also other people's stories who I've worked with or my peers. And that's why I really do engage in a very racial equity, lens perspective, because at the end of the day, racism is the core issue, especially anti-Black racism. And as we know, anti-Black racism also exists in the Tamil community against, Afro-descendant people, but then also in terms of white supremacy and shadeism in terms of darker skinned people. So that's a little snapshot. I think I just rambled on, but I'm sure there's more I could share, but I think these are like the highlights.
No, I didn't want to interrupt because I think there's a lot to kind of unpack there. I mean, I guess one of the first things is I think you said something, I don't know, like you might have thought it was like in passing, but I think it's like I'm just curious about it, which is like you kind of mentioned that you don't blame your mom for kind of, I guess whatever your relationship was at that point in time. And like obviously the result of kind of that deteriorating relationship and you ending up in the kind of the system. Um, I'm curious, like, was that like a sentiment you kind of shared very like right after, kind of going through all of this, or like how much work did it kind of take to kind of get to that point where you've kind of, it sounds like you've forgiven her, or at least not forgiven her, but maybe kind of understood or empathized with kind of her situation. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think healing is a lifelong journey. And I've been through multiple adverse experiences. So there's a lot of healing that there needs to be done. But in terms of my mom, like, when you're younger, sometimes you don't really understand the context of things because you're busy being a kid and trying to survive, especially when you come from a place of violence. And I think that because I was removed from that setting, I was able to, number one, have respite from that, and that respite also allowed me to figure out what my own identity is outside of all that violence. And then when I exited the child welfare system, you go from being in a group home with a whole bunch of people, other young people, boys and girls, to being alone. And when you're alone, you have a lot of time to think, a lot of time to reflect. And for the longest time, I was angry. And rage and anger is actually very healthy for healing. It's actually very healthy because your internal system is saying that you were wronged and it was not okay, because it was not okay. So when I say that I understand the outcomes of my mom, it doesn't mean that I'm justifying her actions. It's saying that I understand the root causes of that, and that I'm older now. I'm a lot more mature as well. And I also work in the system, and I've worked with many different types of people. And I do understand that healing is not a privilege that everybody has. And to this day, I don't think my mom ever had the privilege of healing, and proper supports, and even her own, social networks were deteriorated when I was a very young person. So I could see, where the discrepancies might have been exploded and highlighted, and then sustained. But at the end of the day, we come from a very traumatized community, and there's a lot of trauma, and everybody's trying to survive. And then you also add the fact that my mom was a single mom, right? And one thing that I'm very proud of her, to this day, even from when I was younger, is that my mom left my dad before I was born, because he happened to hit her. And she was not going to stand for that. And that's unheard of in the Tamil community, especially back in those days. Even today, it's like you keep that shit in your house, you stay together, and that's it. And my mom didn't believe in that. And I think I get a lot of my strength from my mom, seeing her survive by herself, and also seeing how resourceful she is. She is magnificent in terms of resourcefulness. But in terms of forgiveness, yeah, I think that forgiveness is there. Does it make everything okay? No, it doesn't. Doesn't mean that I don't engage, I don't experience anger here and there. No, it doesn't. These are all normal feelings that we are supposed to be feeling. And it's very toxic to mute and silence those real reactions and responses to violations.
Well said. You're right. It's very unheard of, especially if I guess it sounds like your mom was pregnant with you when she left
Yeah.
your dad, which is, yeah, that's even more unheard of. Like that's a very brave decision. So I can see that. Another thing I kind of want to unpack in like your when you're kind of just talking about kind of your upbringing, because I think you highlighted this before. It's I wouldn't say it's more of a problem, it's a different kind of problem in the US, but you talked about this, I guess essentially poverty to prison kind of pipeline. And in the US it's a lot, I don't know if the word is worse because in the US is for-profit prison, so there's even more kind of a devious reason to kind of keep poverty a real thing. So you kind of have this pipeline of people that can kind of go in and fill up your prisons and build more and make more money. But since Canada isn't like that, well, at least not yet anyways, hopefully it never goes that get to that place. But um, I think you kind of targeted or mentioned kind of, the need to kind of solve that. And I think over the last couple of years, I think the systems and organizations that help kind of reduce poverty at one end have been kind of really been dismantled or like defunded or funding has been reduced. Um, I guess a couple of questions like why do you think this has happened and like I guess beyond I guess increasing funding or creating more organizations to kind of help at one spectrum, how do you think we can kind of address this particular pipeline issue, I guess, and just
Yeah.
I
I
know it
mean,
happens and I know it happens more in racialized communities as well, right? Like if you think of, the First Nations communities or like, immigrants and things like that. So
the system racism is very like, they invest money, a lot of money into intervention, and intervention is like after something happens. And I think earlier in when I was talking about prevention, and prevention is not invested in enough. And part of prevention is not just supporting, family units. It's also looking at systemic policies, because Canada is a racist country. It's still a colonizing country, and it still has a lot of racism toward, Indigenous people who are still fighting for their rights, and fighting for equitable standards. And then also, it's a very anti-Black racist country as well, and we could see that throughout history. And so when we think about the pipeline, the poverty pipeline into various adverse, additional pipelines, and I would say it's a nexus of issues. Part of the issue is the fact that there's a lot of racism in policies, practices, procedures, and the way that institutions surveil specific communities more so and more often than other communities. And oftentimes it is communities where there's many more Black people, for example, or many more Indigenous people, for example, or many more poor people, for example. And in terms of the Tamil community, I could talk about back in the days. I remember growing up, and I grew up in SS. I don't know if people know what SS is, but that's Silver Springs. That's my hood, that I grew up in. And we had a lot of gang violence in terms of Tamil people, our Tamil boy, our Tamil men, right? And it's like, was that their fault though? Nah, it's because of the systemic issue of, being bullied, right, based on racism, and then them needing to come together, to, it's almost like coming together to have some protection, coming together to have some retaliation for the racism and violence that they were facing. And so when that was happening, the response by the city was that they wanted to arrest or deport people, and people did get deported. People were arrested. People are actually, displaced as well. Like whole families were taken from our community and then placed in like Timbuktu, where there's like no other Tamil people, and it was like scarce like areas, where there's no community. And that goes to show the racism, right? Like if the system is always like trying to criminalize people, but they're not looking at the roots of criminality. And the roots of criminality is not the fault of people or communities. It's the fault of how systems and institutions, subscribe to racist, white supremacist realities and norms, that then gets translated into over surveillance, then gets translated into, piping a certain type of profile or demographic to go into poverty, and then over surveilling these people, and then these people now being, driven into pipelines of child welfare, of the prison system, whether it's youth or adult, of human trafficking, even of homelessness, and death. Right. And so I think that it's really a systemic issue, and it's something that we need to address. And we cannot expect sustainable and maintenance worthy, change and transformation without transforming the very racist and white supremacist normalization that this country, this colonial country, was created on.
I guess your kind of solution, in terms of focusing on the root cause and, putting more funding towards the beginning or prevention makes sense. It's similar to like health, right? It's if you look at the healthcare system, if they're putting more money towards solving something when somebody's already experienced some kind of health issue, like there's various kind of health issues that if you're kind of creating more hospitals or more doctors to kind of solve it versus create funding for more exercise awareness among like young kids, or like free, programs at rec centers so people have more access to like health and wellness or more education about it. That would actually save the government a lot of money because it's probably cheaper to focus on prevention than it is, react to like the actual problem itself. So that
And
makes sense.
and one thing that I will add as well is that if you look at the way Canada, evaluates or measures wellness or success as a country, it's very economical. And then when you look at a country like New Zealand, when the previous president or prime minister was there, she had switched things up. And basically, in New Zealand, the metric and the measure for wellness is citizen wellness, like actual wellness. Like, are you happy? Is your mental health being taken care of? Like if you don't invest in the wellness of people, which means making sure that they have all the necessities that they require, including a basic income for sure, in terms of times of like, financial crisis like now, post pandemic and even during pandemic, and the inflation issues that is plaguing us, like everyone. Um, it's so important to reevaluate the way that you measure health and measure wellness of a country. And when you actually look at people as people, you tend to measure things a little bit differently and analyze it in a different level as well. And Canada doesn't do a good job about it. And if we did, then there would be more investment in terms of prevention. There'd be more, audits in terms of policies at the systemic level, whether it's federal, provincial, or whatnot. And there would be a lot more emphasis of making sure that we are nurturing healthy individuals so that we have a healthy economy in the long term. And it's actually cheaper in the long term as well.
This episode is sponsored by nobody. That's right, nobody. So if you could be kind enough to hit that subscribe button, that would mean a lot to me. Yeah, and I agree with that. But I also think if you look at just the numbers, like for example, I think homelessness, I mean, people don't think of it or like it's not like obvious, but the obvious solution to homelessness is give somebody room and shelter, like some place that they can call home. It's a way more cheaper long-term option than the alternative because it results in like if they don't have, I think you kind of talked about it as well, but homelessness kind of gets often drives people down the path to criminality, which is not their fault. It's kind of the circumstances they're kind of
and
born
and
into.
and also it like homelessness, just to expand on the brief thing that you said, it's very expensive. Housing first strategies are so much better because
Hmm.
number one, you're housed, you have better opportunity and space to work on your issues that you have. And also when you're homeless, the cost of homelessness is a public health crisis. We have emergency rooms that are already like to the brim. And then we have a shortage of like doctors. Mental health crises also increases. The cost of a shelter space is expensive. The cost of even the cost of like different types of placements is always going to be more expensive than just giving a person a roof over their head. That's not just a roof, but in a safe neighborhood where they could thrive, right? Where the space and environment is conducive for healing, conducive, and it's trauma informed. And I'm really happy that housing first strategy has taken off in Canada. I think there's a lot more work to be done in Canada. But at the same time, we have to really think about cost and cost effectiveness and ROI, right? Return on investment. And what better return on investment than like, investing in each person, and making sure that their wellness is top notch so that they can produce the way that they should be producing as a capable, able, healthy, resilient, and I said resilient. I don't really like the word resilient. I'll get back to that later. But somebody who has the malleability to really do what's best for them, and also become a tax paying citizen or whatever that is. But you can't expect unhealthy people to be able to do that in a consistent manner.
Yeah, it's kind of sad when people are trying to get arrested because
Shelter,
having
you get
they get
food,
shelter, you get
medicine.
shelter, medicine exact in prison, right? Versus, the alternative, which is kind of sad to say. Um, I thought I had read the story about somebody who was building because I like the concept of tiny homes because I don't believe you need like a large square footage to kind of really provide somebody like anybody to kind of really live in a safe place. But I think somebody was starting to do that with I guess they didn't have a license, but they had provided like these tiny homes for like a bunch of homeless
Also,
people.
encampment, yeah.
Yeah, and the city kind of I guess, I mean, maybe it's for safety, I'm not sure, but it seemed kind of counterintuitive because they weren't funding it, but this person decided to kind of do it on their own. But I think the city, like you said, in general, has kind of started to kind of pick up on, that concept of like, shelter first strategies. So
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, I know we want to hold tangent on that area, but I'm pretty like interested in that area because I feel like I'm more of a like numbers guy, like logical, I guess. So I look at numbers, but it just seems so obvious that here's a clear solution that's like a win-win for like, a government that's funded by taxpayers if you want to use that money more efficiently, and you get people better, hopefully, at a faster point than kind of running them around all these different directions.
And I mean, even when you think about tiny houses,
Yeah.
what ends up happening is, I mean, even for normal rentals and so on and so forth, there's the financialization of housing and the issue of that.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, even in terms of these uh, quote unquote cheaper options for housing people who are precariously housed or experiencing street homelessness and so on and so forth. The sad part is that the problem is that there's corporate landlords and corporate investors and investors in general who then mark up those prices anyways. So that's a huge problem, and we're already seeing, the extent of the dismal reality of housing right now, whether it's people wanting to get into the housing market themselves as homeowners, or people who are in the rental market who are unable to pay rent, while rents are being increased because landlords can't come up with the payments for themselves, right? Like, so I think there's always going to be an issue in terms of somebody trying to profit off of other people. And unfortunately, there have been people who tried to, profit off of people with less because they see it as an opportunity to make profit and an opportunity to boost their credibility and their reputation. And I just don't agree with it.
And I guess when you kind of originally talked about your upbringing as well, the third thing that I wanted to kind of touch base is kind of, you mentioned that I guess you were a target of trafficking, but like your gut told you that you were in a bad position and you were kind of able to escape. Um, I recently watched a movie which I know had a lot of criticism, but I think that's what got me to even be curious about it. But Sounds of Freedom. I don't know if you've, yeah, and that really opened my eyes as well about kind of that world. Um, but I guess number one, I guess, how did you, like, I guess, whatever details you want to share, but like, how did you know you were in danger? Like, what was that like, and how did you get out of that? I'm curious if, that's something you're willing to share.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes as adults who have experienced chronic and complex trauma, we think that we're empaths because we're able to pick up on energy and pick up on whatever. It's really trauma. So trauma, which shouldn't be romanticized at all. No young person should be put in a position where they're traumatized or experiencing trauma. There's no way that this should be romanticized to be like, well, if you didn't go through that, you wouldn't be this way, and it's just ridiculous. Having said that, I think that because I had gone through so much trauma since I was 8 years old, I was just very alert. My gut was always right, and we have an uncanny ability that other people may not have, actually other people don't have, where we're able to pick up on energy, pick up on body language, pick up on things that other people are not picking up. And it's kind of similar to a lot of like neurodivergent people who are able to pick up on information that neurotypical people cannot pick up. And when we go through trauma, and the way that I have experienced trauma, I think that it definitely did change up my neurons a little bit, and gave me some superpowers. And when I was in the child welfare system, like I remember my sister and I, or one of my roommates and I, we had left to go hang out with some people, and then my gut was just like, okay, don't leave her and go home, because we had to be home by 9 o'clock curfew, and it was already like 8:30, 8:45. We had to go home, and I was like, I can't leave her, like something's gonna happen. And turns out that one of the guys that we were hanging out with, really wanted to take advantage of her. And then we came back home together, and then we got consequence for me sticking by her and making sure that she was okay. So your consequence for even doing the right thing. And then later on, when there was he was much older. He was like in his 30s or something like that, and one of my roommates had started bringing me around him, and the first couple of days I was like, he's really nice, but this reminds me of somebody else. And then the red flags started going up, and the thing is that people target vulnerable people are people without proper support systems, who may be in the system themselves, and who don't necessarily have like a great friendship circle either, and aren't necessarily connected to trusting adults. And they see all these things, especially because on top of growing up in group homes, I also didn't grow up with a dad and all these other things. So these are layers of nuances that makes me a lot more palatable for these people. And so he would try to like, buy things and, give you gifts and whatever, and tell you that he likes you and whatever. And my red flag was already up when I learned his age. I was like, why are we hanging out with these people? And I thought it was just a hang, right? Like a friendship hang or something. And then when my gut was like, leave, I never saw this person again. at all. Like I just refused. And it was because of the fact that my previous chronic traumatic experiences really did build up that muscle to be able to identify red flags right away that other people cannot. And unfortunately, not everybody who has gone through trauma can do that, but fortunately I was able to. And even if people do have that ability, it's also very hard sometimes to leave those situations when you feel stuck. So it's not to blame people either. But for me, I left and I never saw that person again.
Yeah, just the reason that stuck out is the I think people don't realize how prevalent or like an epidemic you want to whatever you want to call trafficking is. And it's not just like a outside of Canada problem. Like I didn't realize how big of a problem it was within Canada, especially within the Aboriginal community as well. So it's just something I wanted to kind of just highlight. And I thought of because I think I read something um a long time ago about the Super Bowl and like wherever the Super Bowl is,
Yes.
it's like one of the biggest days of like it's like the Christmas for like traffickers or something. I don't know if it was true or not, but I just read something and it stuck out and yeah, just as
It's
you're
true.
speaking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know we kind of focus a lot of time kind of on the past, etc., but it was a very, I think, informative conversation. So I want to kind of talk about the work you're doing now. So I know you started an organization called Ontario Children's Advancement Coalition, OCAC. Work's very inspiring. Like I know you kind of, I mean, it's kind of obvious, like I guess why you started the organization, but maybe talk about what you guys have been able to do from like an impact point of view with the organization.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I even created this was I just co-founded. But even prior to that, I was doing a lot of work that I founded myself, and a lot of initiatives that I found myself, just because I felt like there weren't spaces that needed to exist that existed, especially when engaging with lived experts themselves. So I worked in youth homelessness, and child welfare and interconnected, systems in terms of collaborations. And I think that, right before the OCAC was accredited as a nonprofit in Canada. The reason why we even came on the map was because in Ontario in 2018, the provincial government wanted to close the Ontario Provincial Advocates Office for Children and Youth, which was called the Ontario Child Advocates Office. And I had worked there prior, and it was a place where it wasn't necessarily like a perfect place. It had its faults, but it did a really good job in terms of systemic advocacy, and in terms of gathering people, in terms of lived experts like young people. And it was almost like losing a sacred space. And so when that was happening, I remember hearing it on the news, and I was shocked because we didn't see that coming. And then I called Erwin Ellman, who was the provincial advocate, and he was in another country on another continent, I think, at that time. And I was like, hi, like, how come you didn't say anything to me? And he said, I just found out along with you. So he didn't even know that the province was closing down the independent office of the legislature until I called him as well. And at that point, it was more grieving because it was such a space with memories, um, and just a space that did really great work. Was all the work done in a great way? I don't think so. However, it was still an important integral office, and it did bring together people. And I was part of systemic advocacy in terms of provincial health rights for young people, and it was such an important project. And so I ended up connecting with another young person. And at that time, they were working for a community health clinic. And I said, I'm interested in gathering people. And are you interested in doing that too? They were. And so we ended up gathering with about 20, 25 young people at that time, like the same day that we heard the news, and gathered that people in the basement of the community health clinic. And we started like grieving process. Like, we have the right to grieve. This is grievable. This is a grievance. And at that point, I was like, okay, like, we're grieving, but what are we going to do about this? And then at that point, I started to shift the conversation from grieving to action. And part of the action that we decided was that we're going to start planning, some community action. And by that time, I think a couple of meetings later, we probably had like 6 people left. And that's usually an organic process for groups, right? People fall off, and the right people stay. And with that group, we did a Queen's Park rally where hundreds of people people came. We prior to that rally, we created a Facebook page as well, and we didn't realize it was going to take off. We just wanted to do something to make sure we could, get the office to remain open. And we ended up having the rally, and hundreds of people came, including a lot of young people, and people from the system as well, in terms of people like professionals in the system as well. And then also had partnered with, I think it was Ryerson or another university. Can't remember now who it was, but we partnered with them to do a press conference as well at the legislature, for the media, and also with some of the politicians. And at the rally, we had a bunch of lived expert speakers. We had allied speakers, and we also had major political party politicians there as well, from all parties. I think the only party that wasn't necessarily there, who were invited, but I guess, they had better things to do, was the current provincial government, but it's totally understandable because they were the ones who were closing down the office. And after that happened, we thought, okay, we did what we could do, and now we're gonna go back to our own lives. And I was the Away Home Canada, Away Home Toronto coordinator at the time. So I went back to work, and then we had a lot of like messages on Facebook saying, "Hi, where are you guys?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, maybe there's something here." And then we realized that the community wanted us to exist. And so we started to maintain the Facebook page. And then in 2020, during the pandemic, we got incorporated, officially. And ever since then, and even before then, we've been doing a lot of systemic work. So some of the examples, like actually one of the biggest examples is during the pandemic, right? Like everyone was struggling. A lot of people's voices were being raised and listened to by the media and the governments, but one of the main voices that weren't necessarily listened to were young people, and especially people from the child welfare system, as well as people from newcomer systems as well, who may be experiencing mental health, and so on and so forth, like negative mental health. And so we partnered with another organization. It was a newcomer mental health organization, and Blue Jays Foundation also came on board. And this was supported by the provincial advocate as well, the former provincial advocate, who was no longer a provincial advocate anymore by that time. And we held town halls to listen to what people had to say, and we did like small groups and so on and so forth. And then that information was then compiled to figure out, okay, what are we going to do with this? And then we started to, facilitate and host public virtual events to do some public awareness raising. And then from there, every year on May 14th is Youth and Care Day. And Youth and Care Day is a niche day for our organization, and we're very well known for a niche event for that day. It is attended by people across Canada, including people in the States and other places as well, who are kind of connected to child welfare, or even just the general public who are interested in child welfare. And at that meeting, we started talking about what needs to change, and having a moratorium and so on and so forth. So after that niche event, we then partnered with Cindy Blackstock and the First Nations Caring Society of Canada, and they paid for our infographic to be made so that it's digestible by the public, and by young people, in terms of the recommendations that were coming in from the pandemic. And from there, we then went into doing our campaign, because there was a policy window, and the policy window was the pandemic. And we basically wrote a letter that was sent to the ministers, as well as other important political figures. And then also at the same time, we published that letter for the public, for the general public. And we had over 800 signatures or something like that, including major organizations such as the Children's Foundation of Canada, Amnesty International, and so on and so forth. And that applied some pressure, and the government got in contact with us. And I remember getting the email, and I was like, okay, great. So we ended up at the table. And then from there, we were talking about the moratorium, and also changing the youth transitions reality in Ontario, because it was so dismal, and the fact that it was pushing us into homelessness, it was pushing us into human trafficking, and so on and so forth. And then that landed into the first ever contract that the Ontario government signed with a nonprofit. They've never done this before, where they make it work in partnership with an organization. And we've worked together in partnership with Youth Youth and Care Canada. And that resulted in 2.5 years of work, I guess, in terms of going around the province and listening to people, young people from varying backgrounds and interconnections, and then also supporting the government by being observers at, focus groups with professionals and foster parents and so on and so forth. And then that also then led to the creation of the key indicators, performance indicators, and the key indicators for youth transitions. And that was named the Ready, Set, Go program in Ontario, and it went live on April 1st of this year. Last year, April 1st of last year. It's 2024 now. So this is the type of systemic work that we do. I believe that there is a place for direct work, and it's actually more easily funded when you're doing direct work, because you can quantify with people. But for systemic work and advocacy, it's not a place where there's a lot of philanthropic investment, and that's where the investment should be, because no matter what you're doing on the ground, if the systemic issues persist, then the stuff on the ground will always persist. So we need to change systemic stuff in order for that trickle-down effect to happen, and for changes on the ground to be sustainable, and for them to equate into better outcomes for our young people.
Did you know that every time you left a 5 out of 5 review for this podcast, a Tamil parent lets their child pursue a career in the creative arts? Okay, that's probably not true, but if there's a chance that it is, do you really want to jinx it? Leave a review. Do it for the young creative in you. So if I were to play devil's advocate in the sense that, actually, it's not really devil's advocate, but what you just said is a key point, which is if the systematic issues are still there, the issues on the ground will still happen. Do you think organizations, not like yourself, but like just organizations or people that make a livelihood working in those industries, do you think there could ever be a misalignment of kind of
Of course.
goals of like, hey, if we solve the root issue of this at a systematic level or systemic level, and there's less funding, because this, I mean, that's a positive thing. That means the problem's becoming more better, but people still, it's still like a misalignment, or there could be a misalignment. Have you seen that, or like, do you think this could be a problem,
Yeah.
and like, how do you address this potential issue?
And I think that's a UX misalignment, right? In terms of, the clients that you're supposed to be serving, the populations you're supposed to be serving. And it doesn't mean that every organization, every person in an organization is bad, but there is a quote that I often use. I've been using it since I was a teen. The road to hell was also built on pure intention, and pure intention is not enough for actual change. And sometimes pure intention kind of funnels you into the spiral of just wanting, reputational, opportunities. And unfortunately, mainstream, organizations are better funded than grassroots organizations because they've built that over time. And sometimes these mainstream organizations are led by white people who aren't necessarily from the communities who they're trying to make changes for. And then they still get funded over grassroots organizations that are led by said communities. And so there's a misalignment in terms of the philanthropy world right there, among other misalignments and discrepancies. But I think that just because there's one bad apple doesn't mean that there's a lot of bad apples, right? But I think that in some industries, you need this problem to exist in order for that workforce to exist. In social services, that's a reality, right? But my thing is, I'm trying to work myself out of a position. That should be everyone's goal. I'm not trying to create more issues. I want to nip shit in the butt, and that starts at the systemic level. And in terms of racialized, especially Black people, when they bring recommendations to these mainstream colonial institutions, oftentimes there's retaliation. It might not look like, violence and abuse the way that we know what violence and abuse looks like, but it's retaliation in the way that they start to outcast you, or they start to blame you for things that you didn't do, microaggressions. And it all stems back to anti-Black racism and discrimination. And a lot of these spaces are complicit in terms of its leadership. And I myself have been victim to that as well when I've told, an organization solutions that what needs to happen really to build trust with violated communities through this colonial system and still colonizing system is divesting money, not everything, but divesting some portion of your budget and then reinvesting that or investing that into community solutions and then taking a back seat and supporting those community solutions. You don't have to be the chair of a meeting. You don't have to be at the forefront. Just be behind, and support communities. So there's a lot of issues with the system, but there's a lot of great things in the system as well. So it's really a bag of Skittles. And it just really depends on what organization you're engaging with and who it is. And it's really about individual will. If you don't have the will, you don't have the will to transform. And unfortunately, there's a lot of fear in transformation because a lot of people that are afraid that they're going to lose their job or whatever because there's equitable hiring now. So there's more racialized and Black people coming in. What's going to happen to me and whatever. Does this mean that there are no non-racialized, non-Black, non-Indigenous people that do great jobs? Of course there are. But when we talk about racial equity, these strategies and the attack on DEI that you're seeing in Canada, but especially in the States, it's a real thing. And unfortunately, we experience that here in Canada as well. And there is a lot more work to do. One of my colleagues on LinkedIn had said, it's kind of like a mountain, right? The mountain doesn't erode in a day. The mountain erodes over time. It's kind of like in my head, it's like the Niagara Falls, right? Niagara Falls has been receding over time. It keeps going backwards and whatever in terms of the surface area where the water is, right? In the fall. And it's been eroding over time because as more and more water goes down over time, it's easier for that water to carve. Even though water is not a sharp knife, it's able to carve through that. And it's just like that. You need to have, ongoing, consistent work, and ongoing, consistent reflection, reflexivity, and transformative thinking, and implementation, and then sustain that implementation in order for it to actually transform in the future. It won't happen overnight. And that's one of the issues that I'm very much interested in.
So I know you kind of co-founded this organization and you've been participating in multiple different projects at the same time. Is that kind of the nature of kind of when you're doing work from a social innovation point of view? Because it's not really I guess well funded or there's not a clear path to kind of making a living. I mean, there's some opportunities, but it seems like you've really kind of um done so many different very interesting, relevant projects and continue to do so. So how do you what's your strategy for kind of finding these projects and really just sustaining a living for yourself, doing this amazing work that you're passionate about?
So number one, oftentimes important work is the hardest work. And the hardest work is often the labor of people who have experienced discrepancies in that work. So lived experts. And I think that number one, there's this fallacy that we make money doing this stuff all the time. It's not true. For the longest time, a lot of my work was volunteer. And it was off the side of the desk sometimes if I was working somewhere else, or it was totally volunteer and I was trying to figure out how to scrape other money, doing some consulting on the side and so on and so forth. It's not a choice that I'm in this work. This is a necessity. It's a purpose, a life purpose, because I do not want to see young people and families even experiencing the bullshit that they experience and then the outcomes that they experience based on the inequities and the discrepancies nurtured by these systems that are created by colonial systems themselves, right? So a lot of times it was free labor. It was hard labor, and this was done while I was struggling mentally. It takes a toll on you, but it still had to be done, and I still had to show a face, right? But in reality, I was at home crying a lot of the nights because I was struggling. And I think that it's easy to romanticize this type of work, especially at social entrepreneurship, but it's hard work, especially as a person who's been in the media, whose name is very well known in this work. There's a lot of people who will attack you. Even lateral violence within the population is very real as well. It takes a real toll on you. I've been suicidal and so on and so forth. But in terms of this type of work, it's really project-based work. It's easier to fund project-wise because the philanthropic world and the government, they don't do a good job in terms of supporting grassroots organizations that do real systemic work. And that's a downfall in the system, but we're hoping that will change. And there needs to be more investment in that, because this is where a lot of the changes are happening, right? Like the Ready, Set, Go program would not exist if lived experts didn't do what they had to do to bring it to the forefront and keep it there no matter what. And our job is to keep it there no matter what moving forward as well, because that's not the end of it. There still needs to be changes done. And when you're working with governments and institutions, you have this objective of the final, destination that you want to be in. But then you're also working against like 4-year cycles in government, and you're working against other elements and factors. And so the work really doesn't end ever. There, once you do one thing, you realize that you didn't necessarily land at the objective that you wanted to land, like the destination that you want to land, but through negotiation, we've landed somewhere in the middle, or maybe less than the middle. I don't know, but the moral of the story is that the work is ongoing. Once you have one solution, there's going to be problems coming out of those solutions that you need to solve, and figuring that out as well. So this is never-ending work.
What's been less like a failure or learning lesson you've experienced in the last like 3 to 5 years, and like what was your learning from that?
Huh. I think for me, like I've always, since I was 8 years old, been in survival mode. I just don't know any other world to live in, or any other kind of functioning. So I was always in survival mode. I was always thinking like, where am I going to sleep tonight? Or, like, what's going to happen today? Like, am I going to be surprised with like more violence? Like, what's happening? And I'm a survivor of like sexual assaults and all this other stuff too, right? In my teenage years, but also intimate partner violence, in a long-term relationship, and so on and so forth. And so for me, I've always just been in survival mode, and I always put myself last, because I was always trying to be there for other people. And over time, you realize the number of times that people are not there for me. And I feel like it's just so easy for people who have been through shit to be selfless. And it's important to be selfish, and it's not selfish. This is about, self-preservation, and that's a must. That's a need, that's a necessity, that's not an option. And I think my biggest lesson was, really taking time to figure out how to regulate my system, because I have a dysregulated nervous system because of all my trauma. And that also means that I have an immunocompromised like immune system. I also get sick more easily. And I also have like mind body syndrome, where if when I have anxiety, I have chronic pain. And that's all due to trauma. And it's a privilege when you don't have to deal with these things, but I don't have that privilege. So now I'm in this mode where I'm trying to learn how to put myself first in terms of figuring out what I need, in terms of being in a healing mode that also facilitates a pathway to empowerment, and also just like more space to reflect on things, and having more boundaries. Like, boundaries are so important. I had no boundaries. I was a perpetual people pleaser, and I was taught that from a young age. And so now my favorite word is no. People who know me very well know that there's only a couple people I see in real life, and other people stay online, and that's it. I will not see you. I will not hang out with you. If you call me, I'm not picking up. Like, I just have my boundaries are on point now. And it's because it takes me a lot longer to decompress than other people. And peace is very expensive, and I will not give my peace away. And I already don't have 100% peace, right? So what I do have, I want to nurture it and grow it.
And if you had I mean, I don't know if it's the same answer, but if you had a chance to talk to 16-year-old Cheyanne, like what would you tell her?
I mean, similar to what I said in the previous interview a couple of years ago, but then also adding that there, like when that question is asked, I often think like I wouldn't be who I am if I had not gone through those things. But at the same time, I didn't deserve any of that shit. And I think what I would probably talk to little Shay about is the importance of community, the importance of finding a safe adult and knowing who that safe adult is, the importance of choosing friends, and that it's okay to have, certain phases in your life because we all go through teenage years and whatever. But I think I would sit down with her and nurture skills in terms of coping skills that are more positive. And maybe that may divert some of my experiences, but maybe not. But I feel like I'm very proud of her, and she went through a lot at a very young age. And I would commend her for surviving and for continuing to, take steps forward. And I would also try to console her and just give her a big hug, because when I was growing up, I was kind of emotionally neglected. In a lot of families, you have people who will show love without saying that they love you. I didn't necessarily have that in a way that I needed. Like, there was no emotional connection. But my mom did a very good job in terms of nurturing like extracurricular activities and whatever. That's how she showed love, through money. But I needed other types of love. And I think that I would have talked to Shay and just been like, hey, like, teach mom how to love the way that you needed to be loved. And I think that would have healed my mom too.
And I think I guess when you were saying that, I think when we talked previously, you mentioned kind of you had a different definition of what most people would say family is. I think, I guess for you, family is chosen, not um, kind of the blood you're kind of born into, I guess. Um, has that changed as you kind of, I guess, better reconciled with like your mom or just like anybody else in your like immediate family, or has that kind of sentiment still remained the same?
Family is definitely chosen, whether you're choosing blood family and choosing non-blood family. Family is chosen. I feel like, aside from, whether somebody is biologically related to you or not, it's really about who my heart family is, who gets me, who wants the best for me and knows how to nurture me as well. And I think that for me, that definition will never change. I'm very lucky that, like, in my adulthood, now I think it's 7 or 8 years ago, I met my dad. I have three half siblings who are like now I think 21, 22, 23, and they were like in their teens when I met them. And we have a great relationship. I'm re-entered into the Tamil community, and I love the Tamil community. And I've forgiven my mom, and our relationship will be ongoing in terms of healing. But at the end of the day, I feel like I got to choose them when I was ready to choose them. And that's important. You can't force people to like people or force people to see people a certain way. And if even my dad, my biological dad, if he had entered my life when I was very young, I would have rejected him. But I had time and I had reflection. And then when I had the opportunity, when my sister was like, "Hey, dad's here. Do you want to talk to him?" And I was like, "Wait, what?" Like, okay, let's talk. And it was one of the most healing conversations I have had, where he validated my experience of childhood sexual abuse. He asked me questions about it. He knew that I grew up in the child welfare system, asked me about my chosen mom, my chosen dad, even asked about my biological mom. It was just a very like validating, affirming conversation. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the fact that he also needed that time to become who he is. And he wasn't that person before. And now he's the person where, like, they all live in Germany. So when I go visit them in Germany, if he says something problematic, and I've always been like this since I was little, but if he said something problematic and this happened before, I'd be like, yeah, I don't agree with that. You need to, like, can you repeat what you just said? Because there's something problematic about that. I need you to go to your room and think about it. And my dad will go to his room, think about it, and then come back, and I'll ask him, like, so what were you thinking about? And he's like, honestly, you're right. Okay, what about it am I right? Like, I need you to explain this to me. And he will explain it to me. Doesn't mean that he's going to fix it up like overnight. No, it's a learned process, right? And especially when it comes to like ideology and how you kind of like think about certain things. And I remember that conversation was about my sister saying, well, Shy wears crop tops and mini skirts. Why can't I? And my dad was like, she's educated. She could do what she wants. I was like, I appreciate that, but there's something wrong in terms of how you've kind of developed that. And my dad is very responsive. Does he do my siblings get the same version of him? No, but I appreciate the relationship that we have. And I have great relationships with my cousins, my uncle, my aunt, and these are all relationships that were estranged when I was younger, right? Because I was like rejecting everybody because of the amount of violence that I was facing. But now it's like part of family is that family is chosen when you're ready, and family can be family who you didn't look at as family before, and they become your family again. So it's really an ongoing process, kind of like consent, right? Consent is an ongoing process as well. Just because you consent to something one day doesn't mean you consent the next day. And so relationships are negotiations, and relationships are hard. Relationships are hard work. Family is a verb, right? Relationships, they're verbs. So it's not about what you say or what label a person has. It's about the work that you do to nurture it, and also to heal, and also to overcome issues together, and so on and so forth.
Money can be hard to come by, but here's a $100 opportunity for you. Join my free newsletter for free exclusive content and a free chance to win $100 when I hold special draws. Did I mention that it's free? And in terms of your personal legacy, in a few sentences, like how would you want to be remembered by your friends and family?
Oh, was this question asked before?
I
No,
love
right?
I love asking this question, so maybe, but it's like a question
I
I think about, so that's why I was
I'm
asking.
very stumped because it's funny. Um, I've been in the news, I've gotten awards and so on and so forth. But I'm at a place in my life where prior I've always neglected my personal life. And now I don't care about having a legacy per se. I just want to nurture a personal life that's private, where I could nurture personal relationships that I never got to have in a healthy way before, and build a family maybe, and be a great mom. I think that would be my legacy, to be a great mother, not like the work that I'm doing or whatever. Like since I was little, I wanted to be a mom, and since I was little, I wanted to be the best mom. And obviously, that's not always happening, But being a mom is a learning experience in itself. But for me, I want my legacy to be that my kid knew that when they were in trouble, even if it was their fault or not, they could call me and I will be there. That's my legacy.
Well, that's a good segue into the last part of the podcast. It's a fun speed run, I like to call creator confession. So basically, going to say a bunch of statements,
Okay.
and you're going to say the first thing that pops to mind. Ready?
Okay.
Favorite Tamil food?
Kotroti. No,
Um,
no. Sorry, not kotroti. I would say upama.
oh, interesting. Okay. Something that scares you.
Spiders.
Insecurity that you have.
Oh, I know it's a speed round, but ooh, I have a lot of insecurities. I think my main insecurity is instability.
Favorite TV show you're watching.
Um, sort of.
Place you're itching to travel to.
I do want to travel to Malaysia. My maternal grandmother is Malaysian, so I wanted to see what her world was like.
Fellow Tamil creator you want to give a shout out to.
Um, hmm. I don't I She wouldn't call herself a creator. I think she's a mobilizer in a way. But Darshika, Selva Ratnam, I think that's her last name. But I met Darshika when I was a kid at Cantide when I was in grade 9 or grade 8 going into grade 9, and I've known her since then as like this akka. And she works in social services, does her own thing. In terms of like working with I think it was benefits programs or something like that. But I think for me, like just seeing where she was before and the relationship that we have now as peers, and not as like necessarily an akka. Like I don't know the last time I called her an akka, but I would say Darshika.
Um, Favorite childhood memory.
My favorite childhood memory was actually this might be disturbing, not in a bad way, but when I was little, so my uncle, my mom's youngest elder brother, he was murdered when I was in grade 3. But prior, I remember my mom and my uncle both worked, and one time my mom was working or something like that, and I was home alone with my uncle. And I remember I had to go to the washroom and I had to do a number 2. but I was stuck in the washroom because I didn't know what to do after that, and he didn't know what to do either. So I was stuck in the washroom for the longest time. And it's my favorite memory with him because I spent a lot of time with him trying to figure out like what do we do from here. And then he learned to like wipe my ass and everything. But at the end of the day, like he was my dad figure, and I love that memory with them because we were both clueless, and I was a kid. I was like 2, 3 years old or something like that. And he was like in his late 20s, I think, at that time, or maybe early 30s, maybe. And he was just clueless too because he never had kids or and like that. And he also had polio, so he was disabled. But it was like my favorite memory because I remember it like it was yesterday, and I was like two.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I thought most kids don't remember stuff when they're like that young, but interesting.
When you go through trauma, you
Yeah,
actually have a lot of memory from your earlier years.
interesting. Okay. What do you do for fun outside of work?
Hmm. I am definitely a homebody. But when I say homebody, I mean like I love going over to my sister Carol's place, love hanging out and having some like sister time or just hanging out with my best friends. I think that as we grow older, the more important it is to have your people. And women do a lot better job at this. And that's why our life expectancy is a lot better. There's only one country in the world where men actually are equivalent to women in terms of life expectancy. And do you know why it is? Because they also have men to talk to. Like their friendship circle is not just about watching a game or whatever. They talk about real issues. So my favorite thing to do is just like sit down and just like do life together with people and like have a good time, laugh, and then go back to my place to go to my bed because my bed is a very important aspect of my life, and catching sleep is very important.
No, great point. Loneliness is an epidemic, right? And not just I deal with a lot of seniors, so I see that in the senior population, but the even people our age, there's a huge loneliness epidemic. I think there's like I forgot the number. It was like a pretty high percentage of people who didn't have somebody that they could call in a case of emergency that was a friend or forgot the exact stat, but it's just outlining how even though we're more connected, like digitally, there's still disconnection in person
Yeah.
between people. So especially with men, like men are, I'm seeing that with like people that I know, like just men are just bad at keeping in touch, especially as they change life stages, whether it's like moving or getting married or having kids. And yeah, I've seen women do that a lot better.
And it's also very important to know the difference between party friends and then
Yes.
people who are your people in terms of like your diehard people, but also having your discernment muscle flexing in terms of identifying is this a trauma bond or not? Because trauma bonds are not the best things. And that took me a lifetime to learn, right? And I'm very selective about my people, and my circle will stay my circle in terms of that number. And everybody else, they're friends too, but they're not my circle. And that circle does not trauma bond at all. And I think that's very important for healing too. Get a therapist. That's where you need to talk about your trauma and stuff like that.
Favorite movie of all time. It could be Tamil, English, or both.
Favorite movie of all time. I don't know if you would agree, but ever since like streaming subscriptions, I have a hard time remembering anything that I watch because I watch so much of it and I binge on everything. But I would say The Little Rascals is one of my favorite movies, and Matilda. Like I'm thinking about my childhood. I love those movies. And then also I Am Sam. I will forever love that movie.
Yeah, it's so funny. I don't know why I like most of my favorite movies are pre-streaming, like Gladiator, American
Yeah.
History X. And you said Matilda, which is really funny because it's not like something that a lot of people would say, but for some reason, I think our parents, when we had VHS, we had Matilda, and like whenever we could watch stuff, like we didn't have that many like movies or whatever. So I think we just constantly had Matilda on and we like learned to love it. So it's really funny that you say Matilda. Um, what's a decision you've been putting off for a while?
What's a decision that I've been
Yes.
putting off? I would say Hmm. I would say having children. I believe that you don't have to be married to have children. I believe that you don't even have to be engaged to have children. I think this is a decision that people need to make for themselves. And there are women who have children single, who may use IVF or whatever. But I feel like I've been putting off the decision of having children because I think for me, obviously as women, we have pressure, especially when we're younger. And I'm not necessarily like 21 anymore. But I think that in this day and age with inflation, the economy, the just gloomy outlook of life for future generations, it really puts things into perspective and makes me question whether I should or not. But also making sure that I'm having kids with the right person and not just because I want to get married or just because I want to produce something for the rest of the community to then accept because that's what they want. I want to make sure that this decision is very informed, and I want to also make sure that I am at a place where I'm able to really nurture my kid or kids, and make sure that I could provide them with the emotional support that they require, which I think I can. But I think like the external factors are so tough right now with finances, with everybody's finances. Like I think I read in a newspaper recently, and maybe this is the States, but it's very similar in Canada. 1 year of raising a child is like $36,000 for childcare, just for childcare. That doesn't include diapers, that doesn't include like food for them, formula or whatever, like $36,000 for childcare. Um, we are living in an what is it called, inaffordability, like affordability crisis, I mean. And it's really impacting everybody who's not the 1%, right? And you literally need like $167,000 to actually be able to afford everything that you need to afford. And when I say need, I mean need, not want, but need. And in 1930s or 1938 or even 1960, that like $30,000 is like the dollar is not the same thing as it was before. We are struggling out here, and I think that this big decisions like this should not be made because of community pressure or family pressure. It really needs to be made from an informed point of view.
Have you ever, um, I guess, what's something that you had a different opinion on that you were wrong about, and now you kind of see it differently, I guess?
Um, I think for that question, I would probably say, um, I think that that would go back to like dating, the reality of dating. I think that before I would never have dated people with children or even a child. Um, and then I met somebody who just blew my mind, because they actually became a single father when the mother left when the child was like 1 years old, and he raised that daughter by himself. And that was when he was 20. And I never met somebody like that. And it really he made me put some respect on that. And I'm so thankful to always have an open mind in terms of like meeting new people. But it was my first time meeting somebody or having somebody who had interest in me who had a child. And I just wanted to like get to know more in terms of like that story and whatnot. And I'm just so proud of single fathers out there who are doing what they need to do. And, dads get a bad rap sometimes because the stigma is that dads leave or whatever it is. But I feel like we need to celebrate really great dads out there, who do an amazing job. And I don't think society does a good job of that. But yeah, that's one decision or one perspective that shifted over time for me.
What's a purchase you've made recently that you splurged on in the last couple of years that you have no regret about?
Splurge. I would say, oh, I guess it's a splurge, but spending my money on plane tickets to go to India. So I went to Maharashtra, so Mumbai, Rajasthan in terms of Jaipur, and then Gujarat because my cousin, his second. When I say second wedding, I mean like part two of the wedding happened in India in Gujarat. So the first one happened in Canada, second one in Gujarat, and I traveled for the first time with my maternal uncle, my maternal cousin, and then we met up with my cousin who was getting married and his wife. They were already married here, but they weren't married in India yet. And I think that was like the best money spent. I've never traveled with them, and it goes back to building relationships and strengthening relationships. And I think that we learned a lot about each other in that month or whatever it was that we were together, going through the different 3 different states, and then also through the wedding process. And I feel like I'm a lot closer to those cousins, to those 2 particular cousins. And also I realized that I have a lot of similarities with my uncle that I picked out, that maybe I'm not proud of it myself for having those like, the way that I joke sometimes is just like not okay. And he does the same thing. And then I realized my mom does it too. So it was really nice to just to pick up on like familial things, that really showcases that, yeah, we are family.
What's a pet peeve of yours?
Liars.
If you knew that you were going to die tomorrow, a regret that you would have.
A regret that I would have is probably never having told my mom I love her. I still haven't. I mean, I'm not there yet. I could write it. I could talk to other people about it, but I can't talk to her about it. And I feel like one of my goals is to make sure that she knows that and she hears it from me, before she goes on to the next life. And like, yeah, it's just something that she never heard from me, and I've never heard it from her either, because like it's just the dynamic that we have. But I think I would regret it if I knew I was going to die tomorrow and I didn't tell her I love her.
A celebrity whose life you'd want to experience for one day.
Ooh, I'm not really a celebrity person. However, hmm. Wait, what would your answer be for that?
Celebrity. It's a good question. It's different people at different times. I feel like I have different moods where like I don't know, like if I see somebody inspiring, somebody like that person. So it's really hard to say.
Hmm.
There's
I
like a
think.
guy, for example, like there's a guy I read about. He was a black musician from the South. He spent his life kind of befriending people that were on the total opposite spectrum, like KKK members. And over the course of his life, but he's not really a celebrity, I guess. But he basically got them to leave the KKK and kind of change their mind by showing them what they were kind of hating on. Like, hey, you're hating on the whole philosophies around like hating black people,
Hmm.
and here's why. But I am a black person, and you like know me. Like, this is all not true.
Hmm.
So I found him to be really cool. I think they did a documentary on him, but I guess he could be a celebrity. So it just really depends on, I think, my mood at that time. Like, um, because I think celebrity, I guess there's like the classic definition, but like I think celebrity is also like well known, and it could also be like historical, right? Like I would love to kind of go back and like, I know it's like could sound bad, but like just the great rulers or whatever of like the world, just kind of understand what their day was like. Um, you know, just yeah. So it's like just different things based on my interest or like mood that day.
I feel like, I mean, I'm going to actually talk about actual celebrities, right? Not
Sure.
politicians or whatever.
Yeah.
I think a couple of people. So number one, I am a huge fan of Simone Ashley. She's
Oh
Tamil.
yes.
She's the actress who was in
Yeah.
Bridgerton. I think it was groundbreaking to have a Tamil lead like that in a white setting, like it was. And also she's darker skinned. I think she's like the darkest, maybe most melanated like Tamil person that we see in mainstream media. That everybody can identify in like Hollywood. And I think that she's just amazing, and I think she's funny as well. Another person that I would probably talk about is Rihanna. I love Rihanna.
Mm.
She's talented. And she just has like a larger than life like reality, but she's so humble. And I would love to just enter her brain, because now that she's a mom of two, she's an amazing mom. And I just want to get into her brain and pick her brain in terms of how she balances things out, and also what she wants to teach her sons, because it's a very different rate like upbringing than, let's say, other celebrities with children like Beyonce and Jay-Z, where they have their children working, or the Kardashians or whatever, where they have their children working. And Rihanna's like, no, they're gonna be kids. And I was like, wait, what? Yes. So I'd probably like tap into her brain for that. Um, but yeah, and Nia Long, because I love Nia Long. No other reason than the fact that I love her. But yeah, I'm not really a celebrity person. I don't really like follow celebrities. So I don't know. I
Actually,
don't
now that you're
understand.
talking, it would be like I think Ryan Reynolds,
I love
or
Ryan Reynolds.
or maybe like a Barack Obama, I guess. Yeah. Um, What's a book you read or a podcast you've listened to that's had an impact on you?
Mm. Hmm. I th- I think for me, I my favorite autobiography or memoir maybe is by Michelle Obama. When I was reading, I could see myself in her story and in the way that she thinks and so on and so forth. And I loved reading her book. And I think that book was called Becoming or something. So this was her first book, not the second one. And then in terms of another book that I would say is maybe uh hmm it's a Canadian author from Nova Scotia, and the book was called The Birth House. And I love historical novels that talk about like the way the world was historically, and it was about midwifery in those days. And it just gives you a different perspective on Canada. And also about the women who had to be radical in those days, and it was talking about the difference between the medical model, like surgeon or the physician versus like the midwife who's doing their work and like the tough uphill battle that they've had as women doing that work as well. So I really appreciated that story, and it's a Canadian author, so I totally support it. And then in terms of a podcast, I'm gonna sound like a nerd. I just love like podcasts that just talk about current events and kind of unpack current events. So a lot of news podcasts. So I wouldn't be able to pick one of them. But I would say every single morning I listen to at least one podcast that talks about current events, social issues, and kind of interview different perspectives on that because I think that's very important for us as everyday people to figure out and build our capacity on different perspectives so that we can make our own decision or informed decision on where we want to stand, but then also be open to be persuaded when we need to be persuaded.
What's a new belief, behavior, or habit that's improved your life?
Um, huh. Solitude. I would say solitude. Growing up, I was always partying and whatever, but I was also the honor roll student. I was teacher's pet. I didn't have to do any of my readings to get A's. Like I just kind of breezed through life when I was younger. And I think that I never, part of that is coping from trauma, that I always have to be busy and whatever. And I think that I think I was about 25 when I realized like the importance of just learning how to be by yourself. And I always say now that your company has to be better than my solitude, my own company, for you to be around me. Because if your energy is fucked up, you're not coming around me. And so solitude is a learning that I will continue to learn and continue to nurture, because that is also where healing happens too.
I love it. And finally, what's a piece of advice that you would give your fellow, aspiring Tamil creators out there?
Um, Figure out what your purpose is and the why. When you can figure out the why, and when I say why, like it's really like a why going like 6 times. So why, like think about something, ask yourself why. When you figure out that answer, ask yourself why again. Then ask yourself why again a couple of times. Get to the root of that why. And hold on to that within you, because that's going to be guiding you and pushing you when things are hard. But then also make sure that there is that voice of self-love and self-preservation to remind you that you deserve love, you deserve nurturing, and you deserve rest, but you also deserve to thrive. And figure out what conditions need to be in existence for you to experience all of that. And that at the end of the day, you're not going to get all those factors depending on how the environments are. But I feel like when you know the why, it'll give you that extra fuel so that you don't forget your purpose, you don't forget who you are. Because usually the end result of the why, the root why, goes back to who you are, and why that's important to you and is a reflection of you as a person. And never forget who you are.
Love it. That's a good way to end off the podcast. I have to say, Cheyanne, you really, I guess I would like, I always kind of set my expectations, but like, I think this episode really blew it out of the water. I think you should be in politics or something with
I've
a
been
bigger
told that.
platform. So I feel like, yeah, I mean, there's a ton of stuff that I think as someone kind of listening to your answers that I was kind of like got me thinking. I think people listening to this will really be they don't know who you are and like hopefully they listen. They will really kind of I think enjoy the journey and be inspired by kind of what you've taken to what you're kind of becoming. And yeah, a lot of the stuff you resonated, like, the whole solitude thing. Like I'm on the extroverted end, or sorry, introverted end. And you kind of articulated exactly why I'm selective about kind of where I put my energy, kind of if like I couldn't articulate it, but like if the energy of the people that are asking me of my time or whatever it is not better or doesn't higher quality than me, just because I'm very comfortable hanging or like spending time with myself, then there's no point. And I just, yeah, that was like something that was really impactful. And um just talking about like, male like fathers, and like I think there is a reason why you have a rise of, folks like Andrew Tate and others, um because I had a conversation with somebody about like just there are things you can kind of learn from Andrew Tate, not necessarily things that he's saying, but there are reasons why someone like him exists, which is there's a whole generation of like young men, could be fathers, it could be just like boys or whatever it is, that aren't being spoken to, or they're growing up in a society where it's almost quote unquote bad to be a man. I don't know if like that's the right way, but like I'm just kind of reading upon kind of these things. And so it's just kind of all these things that you said. I think it's just a great episode overall. So
And
thank you
can I
for
say
kind of
one more
jumping in.
thing, actually?
Yes.
One more thing. So one thing that I also want to say is that we as double people, we need to really be proud of how far our ancestors have carried us. If you think back to our early history, there were so many factors that wanted to erase us. So many factors, even before the war, okay, even before the Sri Lankan context, right? There were so many factors and instances of wiping us out, and our ancestors persisted. And if you come from a family where there's a lot of like trauma or there's a lot of issues, I want you to know that you can be that person who ends that generational curse. So you can build generational wealth and generational healing and generational love. And I feel like that's a lesson and a thought that I always carry with me, because I know that I am my ancestors' wildest dream, because I go against everything that was expected of me, for me to become, for me to like how for me to be like. And I feel like my ancestors are watching, guiding, and supporting me through every single step that I take. And I'm protected by my ancestor spirits, and I think that all of us are. And so there will be times where you might be, embarrassed to be Tamil. Depending on your experiences. But I want you to know that our people are strong fucking warriors. We come from a line of like survivors from different things that we've survived. And they fought for our generation to exist, and for future generations to exist, we need to fight. And if you don't know what Tamil, I hope you learn Tamil. It's such an old language. It's the oldest language in the world. It's something to be proud of. But as a Tamil creator, and for other Tamil creators, I feel like we don't celebrate enough the fact that we are Tamil, and that's a reason to celebrate on its own.
Awesome. Well, um, or so I guess Shine, if for those, somebody listening that's inspired and maybe want to connect or yeah, just connect with you, what's the best way for someone to reach out to you?
I would say LinkedIn. So Cheyanne Ratnam, Cheyannne, last name Ratnam. And then if you do have Instagram, it's rising.phoenix7. I honestly I stopped like accepting random people on my page. But I have over 6,000 people because a lot of people were following me for the stuff that I was posting and what I was talking about, but that's also an option. But in terms of professional connections, I would say LinkedIn. And then in terms of connecting on, social media, you could send me a request on Facebook, maybe not a friend request, but like a message. My Facebook is private. But yeah, I wish I could say like, here's my email and whatever. But like I said, my boundaries are very, very strong nowadays.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for making time. Really appreciate it. Like I said, I think people really like this episode. And to everyone listening, thank you guys as always.
Thank you so much.